The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Montgomery mansion, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany floors. Everything in this place spoke of wealth accumulated over generations, from the crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls to the oil paintings of stern ancestors lining the corridor walls. Yet despite all this grandeur, the house felt hollow, as if waiting for something it had lost long ago. Emma Carson moved through the study with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore a simple navy dress that had seen better days. The fabric was worn at the elbows, but clean and pressed. She had been working at the estate for 3 weeks now, hired as a temporary housekeeper while the regular staff recovered from a flu outbreak that had swept through the household. What made Emma different from the others who had come before wasn't just her meticulous attention to detail, it was something else entirely. When Thomas, the head butler, had tried to slip her $20 after she'd stayed late to help prepare for an unexpected dinner party, she had gently pushed his hand away. When Caroline, the cook who had worked there for 15 years, left an envelope with her name on it tucked inside a cookbook, Emma returned it unopened with a note that simply read, "Your kindness is payment enough." This behavior puzzled everyone, but it deeply troubled one person in particular. Behind the locked door of his private office on the 3rd floor, Marcus Montgomery stood watching a monitor displaying security footage from various rooms throughout the house. His eyes were fixed on Emma as she carefully dusted the collection of rare books in the library, her movements slow and respectful, as if each volume were a precious artifact rather than just another possession. Marcus was 38 years old, though the weight of responsibility made him seem older. He had inherited the Montgomery fortune at 25 when his parents died in a sailing accident off the coast of Greece. Since then, he had built the family's real estate empire into something his ancestors could never have imagined. But success had come at a price. He trusted no one, questioned everything, and kept his distance from anything that resembled genuine human connection. Next to him, his personal assistant Victoria checked her tablet and said, "She's been nothing but professional." The rest of the staff adores her. "She works harder than anyone we've had in years." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He leaned closer to the screen, watching Emma pause to straighten a picture frame that was tilted by barely a degree, something no one else would have noticed or cared about. "That's exactly what concerns me," he finally said. His voice was flat, controlled. "When something looks too perfect, there's usually a reason." Victoria sighed. She had worked for Marcus long enough to know where this was coming from. "Not everyone is out to betray you," she said gently. Marcus turned to face her, his expression hardening. "When I was 12, he began, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "We had a nanny named Isabel. She'd been with us for 3 years. She taught me Spanish, made me hot chocolate on cold nights, read me stories when I couldn't sleep. My mother loved her like a sister. Then one morning, we woke up to find the safe empty and Isabel gone. 200,000 in jewelry, cash, and bonds. We never saw her again." He turned back to the monitor, his jaw tight. "My father told me that day that the people who smile the easiest often hide the darkest intentions. That kindness can be the most effective disguise. I've never forgotten that lesson." Victoria studied his profile, seeing the pain behind the armor. "Maybe she's just a good person," she offered. "Or maybe she's patient," Marcus replied, waiting for the right moment. He crossed his arms. "I want to see what she does when she thinks nobody's watching. Not when being honest is easy, but when it costs her something." Victoria frowned but said nothing. She knew that tone. Marcus had made up his mind. The next afternoon, Marcus carefully arranged his trap. In the sunroom, where afternoon light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, he placed several items on the glass coffee table. His wallet, thick with cash and credit cards, a Rolex watch he'd received as a gift from a business partner. and most conspicuously, 5 $100 bills arranged in a careless fan, as if someone had been counting money and simply forgotten it there. Then Marcus positioned himself on the nearby chaise lounge, angling his body so he appeared to have fallen asleep while reading. He changed into casual clothes, a linen shirt and slacks, and placed an open book face down on his chest. A pair of reading glasses sat slightly askew on his nose. Every detail was calculated to create the image of someone who had dozed off unexpectedly. Behind a decorative wall panel, a hidden camera recorded everything. Marcus had personally checked the angles that morning, ensuring there were no blind spots. Now, he lay perfectly still, controlling his breathing, keeping his eyelids relaxed. He had practiced this. He was determined to know the truth. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 3. Right on schedule, he heard footsteps approaching. They were light, hesitant. Emma appeared in the doorway carrying a basket of cleaning supplies. She paused when she saw him, clearly not wanting to disturb what she thought was genuine sleep. Marcus listened to her gentle movements as she entered the room. Her steps were careful, purposeful. She began dusting the windowsill on the far side of the room, working her way methodically around the space. He could hear the soft swish of her cloth against the glass, the quiet click as she adjusted a decorative vase. Then her footsteps stopped. She had seen the table, the money, the expensive watch, him lying there, apparently unconscious. Marcus's heart rate increased despite his best efforts to remain calm. This was the moment. Would she take the bait? Would she pocket the cash, thinking no one would know? He waited, counting the seconds. 5, 10, 15. Nothing happened. No movement toward the table. Instead, he heard her resume cleaning, now working on the opposite side of the room. She was deliberately avoiding the temptation, giving it a wide berth as if the money were radioactive. But then, her footsteps approached. Marcus tensed, ready to open his eyes and confront her, but she walked past the money entirely. He felt a subtle shift in the air as she moved behind the chaise lounge. She wasn't going for the wallet or the watch. She was adjusting something on the bookshelf behind him. There was a soft sound, like paper sliding against wood. Then footsteps moving away from the money, not toward it. Marcus risked the tiniest crack in his eyelids, just enough to catch a glimpse through his lashes. Emma had taken a hardcover atlas from the shelf and was now placing it carefully over the scattered bills, concealing them from view. Not hiding them in shame or guilt, but protecting them, as if she thought it irresponsible for such valuable items to be left exposed. Marcus felt something unexpected twist in his chest. Confusion, perhaps, or something more unsettling. Emma returned to her cleaning, working quietly for several more minutes. Then she approached him again, and this time Marcus heard a different sound, the gentle rustle of fabric. She had picked up something, the cashmere throw that had been draped over the arm of the chaise. He wanted to stop her, to open his eyes and end this charade. But something made him wait. The blanket settled over him, light and warm, tucked carefully around his shoulders. Her fingers brushed against his temple as she gently moved a strand of hair that had fallen across his forehead. The touch was so tender, so unexpected, that Marcus had to concentrate hard to keep his breathing steady. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were saying a prayer she didn't want anyone else to hear. "Thank you for this opportunity. I promise I'll make you proud." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. There was no performance in her tone, no awareness of cameras or judgment, just genuine gratitude spoken to a man she believed was sleeping. He heard her footsteps retreat, heard the door close softly behind her. Still, Marcus didn't move. He lay there under the blanket she had placed over him, his eyes still closed, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. For the first time in over a decade, the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself felt insufficient, inadequate against something as simple and devastating as unwitnessed kindness. When he finally sat up, the room felt different somehow. The sunlight seemed harsher, more accusatory. He looked at the atlas covering the money, at the blanket still warm around his shoulders, and realized with uncomfortable clarity that he had been testing the wrong person. The one who had failed this test wasn't Emma. It was him. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his office with the security footage playing on loop. He watched it again and again, studying every frame. The way Emma had paused when she saw the money, not with hunger or calculation, but with concern for his well-being. The careful way she had covered the cash, not to hide evidence but to protect it. The tenderness with which she had tucked the blanket around him, a gesture that belonged to a different kind of relationship entirely. He stopped the video on a single frame, her face visible as she whispered those words. Her expression was open, vulnerable, completely unguarded. This wasn't the face of a con artist or a thief. This was someone who genuinely cared, even when she thought no one was watching, especially when she thought no one was watching. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "What am I doing?" he muttered to the empty room. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Over the following days, Marcus found himself paying attention to Emma in ways he hadn't before. Not as an employer suspicious of an employee, but as someone genuinely curious about who she was. He began noticing the small things she did, the acts of kindness that no one had asked for and that she never mentioned. One morning, he arrived early to find the fountain in the east garden running again after months of disrepair. No one had reported fixing it, but Marcus noticed Emma's cleaning cart parked nearby, a wrench sitting on top that definitely wasn't standard housekeeping equipment. She must have repaired it herself, on her own time, simply because she thought it should work. Another day, he found Victoria's elderly mother sitting in the kitchen laughing over tea. Emma had noticed the older woman struggling with her medications and had created a simple color-coded chart to help her remember which pills to take when. She had also researched which foods interacted with the medications and left a printed guide on the counter. When Marcus asked Victoria about it, she had simply smiled and said, "Emma did that. She wouldn't accept a penny for it." Then there was the incident with Daniel, the groundskeeper's teenage son, who came by after school to help with yard work. Marcus overheard them talking one afternoon in the greenhouse. The boy was upset about failing a math test, convinced he was stupid and would never get into college. Emma was sitting with him, patiently working through the problems, explaining concepts in different ways, until understanding dawned in his eyes. She wasn't a teacher. She had no obligation to help. But she had stayed 2 hours past the end of her shift, refusing payment, simply because a kid needed help. These weren't grand gestures designed to be noticed. They were quiet acts of care, woven into the fabric of her daily life. Marcus began to understand that this was simply who Emma was, not a performance, not a strategy, just her nature. The realization troubled him more than he wanted to admit. He had spent so much of his life protecting himself from betrayal that he had forgotten what genuine goodness looked like. And now, confronted with it in its purest form, he didn't know what to do. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Marcus stood at the window of his study, looking down at the garden. Emma was there, kneeling beside the rose bushes with her phone pressed to her ear. Even from this distance, Marcus could see that something was wrong. Her shoulders were shaking. She pressed her hand to her mouth as if trying to hold back sobs. He watched, feeling like an intruder, as she ended the call and sat there alone in the fading light. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, took several deep breaths, and then slowly stood up. She straightened her shoulders, composed her face, and walked back toward the house as if nothing had happened. Marcus stood frozen at the window long after she had disappeared from view. In that moment, seeing her private pain, her struggle to maintain composure, something fundamental shifted in his chest. She wasn't just an employee. She wasn't a potential threat to be monitored and tested. She was a person, complex and hurting and brave, and he had treated her like a criminal. The next morning, Marcus woke before dawn. He made his way to the kitchen and prepared a simple breakfast, tea and toast with honey. Then he took an envelope from his desk, placed a significant amount of cash inside, and wrote a brief note on the front. "This is an advance on your salary. Please accept it. No questions asked." He left it on the small table in the staff break room, where Emma always took her morning coffee. Then he returned to his office and waited, watching the security monitor not to spy, but because he genuinely wanted to know if she would accept it. When Emma found the envelope an hour later, she stood holding it for a long moment, her hands trembling. She looked around the empty room, confusion and gratitude warring on her face. Finally, she opened it, saw the money, and read the note. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She carefully placed the envelope in her bag, then bowed her head as if in prayer. Marcus turned away from the monitor, unable to watch any more. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. This wasn't about trust or suspicion anymore. This was about something far more complicated and terrifying. This was about beginning to care. The crisis came on a Tuesday afternoon during a luncheon Marcus was hosting for several potential investors. The estate was bustling with activity, servers moving smoothly between tables, conversation flowing easily under the white tent set up in the garden. Everything was proceeding perfectly until one of the guests, a woman named Patricia Vanderbilt, stood up with a look of theatrical outrage on her face. "Excuse me, everyone," she called out, her voice cutting through the pleasant murmur of conversation. She held up a small square of fabric, a handkerchief embroidered with delicate flowers. "I believe someone has been playing games." The tent fell silent. All eyes turned to Patricia, who was clearly enjoying the attention. "I found this tucked under my chair," she continued, a knowing smirk on her face. "How very convenient, how very deliberate." She looked around the table meaningfully. "I've been to enough estates to recognize a classic ploy when I see one." The implication was clear and ugly. Marcus felt anger rise in his chest, not at the accusation itself, but at the smug certainty in Patricia's voice, the assumption that she understood everything. Within minutes, Emma was called into the hallway outside the tent. She arrived quietly, her face pale but composed. Thomas stood beside her, holding the handkerchief gently between his fingers. "Is this yours, Emma?" Thomas asked softly, his tone kind. Emma looked at the handkerchief, at the small embroidered flowers in the corner, each petal slightly uneven, clearly done by hand. "Yes," she said simply. "It must have fallen from my apron pocket while I was serving." "She didn't do anything wrong," Thomas said firmly, turning to Marcus, who had followed them out. "I've known this girl for weeks. She wouldn't." But Marcus was looking at Emma, really looking at her. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her jaw tight, but her eyes held something that made his chest constrict. Not fear of being caught, but the weary resignation of someone who had been through this before. "Emma," Marcus said quietly, his voice betraying none of the turmoil he felt, "did you leave that handkerchief deliberately to get someone's attention?" "No, sir," she said immediately. Then softer, "No, I would never." "Then why didn't you defend yourself when Patricia accused you?" Marcus pressed, though he already knew this conversation was wrong, that he should be defending her, not interrogating her. Emma's composure cracked, just slightly. "Because it wouldn't have mattered," she whispered. Then the dam broke. "I used to work at St. Catherine's Hospital," she said, the words coming faster now. "There was a patient, Mrs. Chen. She collapsed during the night shift. The paramedics were delayed, and she was losing too much blood. I gave her my blood, type O negative, universal donor. It saved her life." Emma's voice shook, but she continued. 2 days later, someone reported that Mrs. Chen's wedding ring had gone missing from her bedside table. They found it in the pocket of a coat I had borrowed from the staff room. It wasn't even my coat, but that didn't matter. I didn't take that ring. I don't know how it ended up in that pocket. But no one asked. They just let me go." She looked directly at Marcus now, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Since then, when people accuse me of something, I don't explain. I don't fight. I just leave. It's easier that way. People believe what they want to believe, and nothing I say will change their minds." The hallway was completely silent. Marcus felt as if someone had punched him in the stomach. He looked at the handkerchief in Thomas's hand, seeing it now for what it truly was, not a ploy or a trick, but a memory. Something precious carried by someone who had already lost too much. Thomas quietly excused himself, leaving them alone. Emma started to turn away. "I'll pack my things," she said quietly. "No," Marcus said sharply. The word came out more forcefully than he intended. Emma stopped, surprised. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You're not going anywhere." She turned to face him, confusion and hope warring in her expression. "I was wrong," Marcus said, and the words felt foreign on his tongue, uncomfortable and necessary. "I tested you, I doubted you, and I was completely, inexcusably wrong." He reached out and carefully took the handkerchief from Thomas's hands, then pressed it gently into Emma's palm. "You don't owe anyone an explanation. Not Patricia Vanderbilt, not anyone else, and especially not me." For the first time since coming to work at the Montgomery estate, Emma allowed herself to cry, not from fear or shame, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being believed, of finally being seen not as a suspect, but as a person worthy of trust. The next morning, Marcus found Emma in the back hallway, reorganizing the supply closet with her characteristic precision. He watched her for a moment, noticing the way she hummed softly to herself as she worked, the way a shaft of sunlight caught in her hair. "Emma," he said softly. She turned, startled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Would you take a walk with me?" She hesitated, then nodded. He led her through the house and out through a side door she had never used before. They walked in silence across the lawn, past the formal gardens, until they reached a weathered wooden gate, almost hidden by climbing vines. Marcus pushed it open, the hinges creaking softly. Beyond lay a small wild garden, untamed and beautiful in its neglect. Roses grew in tangles, wildflowers pushed up between the stones of a forgotten path, and an old wrought-iron bench sat beneath an apple tree heavy with fruit. "This was my mother's garden," Marcus said quietly, his voice softer than Emma had ever heard it. "She spent every morning here, said it was the only place she could think clearly. After she died, I locked the gate. I haven't let anyone in since." Emma looked around, sensing the weight of what he was showing her. The garden felt sacred somehow, suspended in time. "I need to apologize to you," Marcus continued. "Not just for yesterday, but for everything. For watching you like a criminal, for testing you, for assuming the worst." He turned to face her, and Emma saw something raw in his expression. "I've spent so long protecting myself from being hurt that I forgot how to recognize something real when it was right in front of me." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to explain," she said softly. "Yes, I do," Marcus insisted. "You taught me something important, that sometimes the people who speak the least have the most to say, that silence isn't always weakness, it's sometimes the armor of someone who has been hurt too many times." He gestured to the garden around them. "This place felt dead for a long time, but standing here with you, it feels alive again." From that day forward, subtle changes rippled through the Montgomery estate. Marcus began joining the staff for their morning coffee break, something the previous master of the house would never have considered. At first, the staff was nervous, unsure how to act around their employer. But Marcus kept coming, kept pouring his own coffee, kept asking genuine questions about their lives. And gradually, the invisible walls between upstairs and downstairs began to dissolve. He started asking Emma's opinion on things that had nothing to do with housekeeping. Should he donate his father's collection of military memorabilia to a museum or keep it? What color should he paint the library? Did she think the East Wing should be renovated or preserved as it was? Her answers were always thoughtful, careful, and often surprisingly insightful. He found himself valuing her perspective more than he had valued the advice of expensive consultants. One afternoon, Marcus was walking through the gardens when he heard laughter, bright and genuine. He paused, curious, and followed the sound to the vegetable garden behind the greenhouse. Emma was there with Roberto, the elderly groundskeeper, both of them covered in dirt and grinning like children. Emma was showing him something on her phone, a gardening article about companion planting. As Marcus watched from behind a hedge, Emma said something that made him freeze in place. "You know what I think, Roberto," she said, her voice warm. "I think the most important thing we can do in this life is make someone's day a little bit easier, even if it's just pulling weeds or making tea or listening when someone needs to talk. That's what matters." Roberto nodded, smiling. "You're a good soul, Emma Carson. This old place has been waiting for someone like you." Marcus stood there long after they had returned to work, Emma's words echoing in his mind. He thought about Isabel, the nanny who had betrayed his family all those years ago. He thought about all the walls he had built, all the people he had kept at arm's length, all the opportunities for connection he had deliberately destroyed in the name of self-protection. And he realized with startling clarity that he had been half alive for years, protecting himself so fiercely that he had forgotten how to truly live. The storm arrived without warning on a Thursday night. One moment the sky was merely overcast. The next, thunder was shaking the windows, and rain was hammering the roof like artillery fire. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely, plunging the mansion into darkness. Marcus grabbed a flashlight from his office and made his way downstairs. The backup generator kicked in, restoring power to the security systems and emergency lighting, but several wings of the house remained dark. As he rounded the corner toward the kitchen, he saw movement by the window, a figure pressing something against the glass. It was Emma. One of the kitchen windows had cracked under the force of the wind, and rain was pouring through the gap. She was using towels to try to block the water, but she was already soaked through, her dress clinging to her shoulders, her hair plastered to her face. She was shivering violently. Marcus didn't think. He crossed the room in 3 strides, shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Come on," he said quietly, taking her hand. Not commanding, just guiding. He led her through the dark hallway to a small staff kitchen near the service entrance, one of the few areas that still had power. It was cramped and cluttered, but it was warm and dry. Emma stood near the counter, her arms wrapped around herself under his jacket, her head bowed. Marcus busied himself with the kettle, making tea more to give his hands something to do than out of any real need for hot drinks. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows, but in this small kitchen they were safe. They sat in silence for a long time. Marcus on a stool by the counter, Emma leaning against the wall. The only sounds were the whistle of the kettle and the drum of rain on glass. Finally Marcus spoke. "Why did you stay?" he asked quietly. Emma looked up, confused. "After everything," he clarified. "After I tested you, doubted you, made you prove yourself over and over. You could have left. You should have left." Emma looked down at her hands, at the sleeves of his jacket hanging past her fingertips. "Because," she said softly, "this place needed me." "You need to be needed," she added, even softer. "And I didn't want to leave while someone was still pretending they don't need anybody." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. She wasn't looking at him, but somehow she saw straight through every defense he had ever constructed. He turned away, looking at the rain streaking down the window, blurring the world outside into abstract shapes. "I don't know how to let people in," he admitted. "I don't know how to trust without constantly waiting for the betrayal." Emma moved closer. Her voice was gentle but firm. "You don't have to know how. You just have to be willing to try." Marcus looked at her then, really looked at her. Her face was still damp, her cheeks flushed from cold. but her eyes were steady, patient, understanding. And in that cramped kitchen, under the harsh fluorescent light, Marcus did something he had never done without overthinking it first. He reached out, his hand hovering for just a moment before gently brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. His palm settled against her cheek, warm despite the cold of the storm. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a declaration. It was simply the first time Marcus Montgomery had touched something he was terrified of losing. And for Emma Carson, it was the first time someone had touched her like she was something precious and real, not fragile or suspect, just genuinely valued. The rain continued to fall, but inside that small kitchen, something far more important had just begun to grow. 3 months later, the Montgomery estate was transformed for the annual charity gala. Lights were strung through the trees, the gardens were manicured to perfection, and luxury cars lined the circular driveway. Women in designer gowns and men in tuxedos filled the ballroom, champagne glasses in hand, their laughter mingling with the soft music of a string quartet. But Emma wasn't watching from the sidelines. She stood near the main entrance in a simple but elegant dress the color of champagne, a clipboard in her hand, greeting each guest with practiced warmth. Marcus had asked her, no, he had insisted, that she oversee the event. Not as staff, but as the person he trusted most in the world to ensure everything ran smoothly. When she had protested, he had simply smiled and said, "There's no one else I'd trust with something this important." Now, as the evening unfolded around them, Marcus watched her from across the room. She moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, solving problems before they became crises, making guests feel welcomed and valued. She had been hesitant at first, unsure of her place in this world of wealth and privilege, but Marcus had seen what she couldn't, that she didn't need to belong to this world because she had something far more valuable than money or status. She had integrity, kindness, and a genuine care for others that transformed every space she entered. Later in the evening, as dinner concluded and the music shifted to something slower, Marcus stood and tapped his glass with a fork. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the ballroom, "I've given many speeches at events like this over the years. I've talked about investments and returns, about buildings and bottom lines. But tonight, I want to talk about something different." The room was completely silent now. Marcus took a breath, his eyes finding Emma in the crowd. She stood frozen near the back wall, her expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "I want to tell you about someone who came into my life a few months ago and taught me things I should have learned long ago. This person arrived with nothing to prove and nothing to gain except honest work and a fair wage. And through simple, quiet actions, through kindness that expected nothing in return, this person reminded me what it means to be truly good. Not good when it's convenient, not good when people are watching, but good because that's simply who you are." He paused, emotion threatening to overtake his carefully measured words. "I won't say her name because she would hate for me to single her out. But I will say this. Some people shine so brightly that they illuminate the darkness in others, not to expose it, but to help them find their way out. And for that gift, I am more grateful than I have words to express." The applause that followed was genuine, warm. Several people turned to look at Emma, who had tears streaming down her face. When Marcus stepped down from the small platform, he walked directly to her. In his hand was a small velvet box. He opened it without ceremony, revealing a delicate pendant in the shape of a compass rose, the silver gleaming under the lights. It had belonged to his mother, one of the few pieces of her jewelry he had kept. "My mother used to say that we're all lost sometimes," Marcus said quietly, so only Emma could hear. "But the people who help us find our way are the ones worth holding on to." He lifted the pendant from the box. "You've helped me find my way back, Emma. I want you to have this." Emma couldn't speak. She turned so he could fasten the clasp around her neck, the pendant settling just below her collarbone. When she turned back to face him, Her eyes were still wet with tears, but she was smiling. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for believing me, for giving me a chance when I thought I'd run out of chances." Marcus shook his head. "I should be thanking you," he said, "for not giving up on someone who didn't deserve your patience." They stood there for a long moment, the party continuing around them. But in that instant, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under Emma's door while she was still sleeping. When she opened it, her hands began to shake. "Congratulations," the first line read. "You have been awarded a full scholarship to the nursing program at Columbia University." Emma's vision blurred. She had never applied. She had given up on that dream years ago, convinced it was out of reach for someone like her. But as she read further, the truth became clear. Someone had submitted an application on her behalf, had written recommendation letters, had paid the application fees. Someone had believed in her potential, even when she couldn't believe in it herself. At the bottom of the letter, in familiar handwriting, was a single line. "You were always meant for more than this. Go become who you're supposed to be." She found Marcus in the garden an hour later, kneeling by the flower beds, his hands covered in soil. He looked up when he heard her approach, and something in her expression made him stand. "You did this," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus wiped his hands on his pants, suddenly looking uncertain. "You gave me my blood once," he said quietly. "The least I could do was help you follow your dream." Emma shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes," Marcus said firmly, "I did, because you deserve it, because the world needs more people like you in it, and because—" He hesitated, then continued more softly, "because I care about you too much to hold you back." Emma stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." They stood like that for a long moment, Marcus's arms coming up to hold her gently. Finally, Emma pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'll have to leave in 2 weeks," she said, "to get settled before classes start." Marcus nodded, though something flickered across his face. Disappointment, perhaps, or loss. "I understand," he said. Then, meeting her eyes, "But Emma, if you ever want to come back, for a visit or for good, this place will always be your home, and I'll always be here." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Emma nodded, not trusting herself to speak. 2 weeks later, on a bright September morning, Emma stood at the front gate with a single suitcase. The car that would take her to the train station idled nearby, but she couldn't seem to make herself move. She turned back to look at the mansion one more time, at the gardens she had tended, at the windows she had cleaned, at the place that had become so much more than just a job. Marcus stood on the front steps, his hands in his pockets, watching her. Their eyes met across the distance, and Emma felt her heart break just a little. This was the right thing to do. She knew that. But knowing something is right doesn't always make it easier. She raised her hand in a small wave. Marcus returned it, a sad smile on his face. Then Emma climbed into the car, and it pulled away, carrying her toward a future she had never dared to imagine. 9 months passed. Autumn returned, painting the world in shades of amber and rust. The gardens at the Montgomery estate bloomed with chrysanthemums and asters, and the air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke from the library fireplace. Marcus knelt in the herb garden behind the greenhouse, carefully pruning the lavender bushes Emma had planted before she left. He had taken over their care himself, finding a strange peace in the repetitive work, in keeping alive something she had created. The plants were thriving under his attention, their purple flowers bright against the grey stone pathway. He was so focused on his work that he didn't hear the gate open behind him, didn't hear the footsteps approaching on the gravel path. It wasn't until a familiar voice spoke that he looked up. "You're getting better at keeping things alive," the voice said, warm and teasing. Marcus turned, his heart suddenly pounding. There she was, Emma, standing in the garden as if she had never left, though everything about her seemed brighter somehow, more confident, more herself. "I thought I'd come check on the lavender," she said, smiling, "and maybe on the person who's been taking care of it." Marcus stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, unable to look away from her. "You came back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Emma moved closer, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small wrapped package and handed it to him. He opened it carefully, unfolding the tissue paper to reveal a handkerchief, pristine white linen with embroidery along one corner. 2 names stitched in silver thread, Marcus and Emma. He stared at it for a long moment, his thumb tracing the letters. Then he looked up at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "So this time you meant to leave it behind," he said softly. Emma laughed, the sound bright and free. "No," she said, her eyes shining. "This time I want you to keep it." Marcus closed the distance between them, the handkerchief still clutched in his hand. He didn't ask if she was staying or for how long. He didn't ask about school or plans or what came next. In that moment, none of it mattered. She was here, and that was enough. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, they found themselves in the kitchen together. Marcus stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, washing vegetables for dinner. Emma sat on the counter nearby, legs swinging gently, watching him with amused affection. "Never thought I'd see Marcus Montgomery doing dishes," she teased. He glanced over his shoulder, grinning. "Don't tell anyone. It would completely destroy my reputation as an aloof billionaire." Emma laughed, and the sound filled the kitchen, warm and genuine. Marcus turned back to his work, but he was smiling too, broader than he had in months, maybe years. "You know," Emma said after a moment, her voice softer now, "I learned a lot at Columbia. About medicine, about science, about how the body works." Marcus turned off the water, listening. "But the most important thing I learned," she continued, "wasn't in any textbook." She looked at him, her expression serious now. "I learned that home isn't a place. It's the people who see you for who you really are and love you anyway." Marcus dried his hand slowly, then moved to stand in front of her. "And did you figure out where your home is?" he asked quietly. Emma reached out and took his hand. "I think I've known for a while," she said. "I just needed to be sure I was coming back for the right reasons. Not because I needed saving, not because I was running from something, but because this is where I choose to be. Where you are is where I choose to be." Marcus lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I spent so many years afraid of being betrayed again," he said. "Afraid that if I let anyone close, they would eventually hurt me. But you taught me something more important than caution. You taught me that some risks are worth taking, that some people are worth trusting, even when it terrifies you." They stood like that for a long moment, hands clasped, the kitchen growing dim as the last light faded from the sky. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear. Inside, 2 people who had been broken in different ways had found a way to heal together, not by fixing each other, but by creating something new, something neither of them could have built alone. Emma slid down from the counter, and Marcus pulled her into his arms. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. This was what safety felt like, she realized. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of someone who chose to stay even when staying was difficult. "So what happens now?" Marcus murmured against her hair. Emma pulled back just enough to look up at him. "Now," she said, "we figure it out together. I finish school. You keep building your empire. And we meet in the middle, in moments like this." Marcus smiled. "In moments like this," he repeated. "I can live with that." They returned to making dinner together, moving around each other with easy familiarity. Emma chopped vegetables while Marcus monitored the stove. They talked about her classes, about a new project he was developing, about nothing and everything. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter and comfortable silences. Later, after they had eaten and cleaned up, they walked through the gardens together. The night was cool and clear, the moon bright overhead. The lavender released its scent as they brushed past, sweet and calming. Marcus stopped beside the plants, looking down at them. "You started something here," he said, "something that lasted even after you left." Emma squeezed his hand. "Some things have strong roots," she said. "They survive even when you're not there to tend them every day." He understood the metaphor, heard what she was really saying. Their connection had survived distance and time. It would survive whatever challenges came next. They stood together in the moonlit garden, two people who had learned the hard way that trust is not given lightly, but once earned, it can transform everything. Marcus had tested Emma, doubted her, almost lost her, and Emma had been patient enough to wait for him to find his way through his own fear. Now, standing in the place where his mother had once found peace, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the cautious, guarded hope of someone expecting disappointment, but the genuine, open hope of someone who had finally learned that the risk of loving is always worth the reward. "You know what the best part is?" Emma said, leaning against his shoulder. "What's that?" "The best part is that we both chose this. Not because we had to, not because we needed to, but because we wanted to. That's what makes it real." Marcus wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "You're right," he said softly. "And that's what makes it last." They walked back to the house together as the night deepened around them. Inside, lights glowed warm and welcoming. The kitchen where they had cooked together. The library where Emma had once carefully catalogued books. The sunroom where Marcus had pretended to sleep while testing her character. Every room held memories now, moments that had shaped them both. As they reached the front door, Emma paused and turned to Marcus. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For giving me a chance when no one else would, for seeing past my silence to what was underneath, for being patient enough to let me prove myself even when I didn't think I needed to." Marcus cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing her cheeks. "Thank you," he replied, "for being exactly who you are, for refusing to pretend, for showing me that genuine goodness still exists in the world." He leaned down and kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Emma was smiling. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "Let's go inside. It's getting cold." But as they crossed the threshold together, Marcus realized he had never felt warmer in his life. The house that had once felt like a mausoleum, grand but empty, now felt like a home, not because of the expensive furnishings or the impressive architecture, but because of the woman walking beside him. The woman who had taught him that the greatest wealth isn't measured in money or possessions, but in the connections we build with others. Emma looked back at him, her eyes bright with happiness. "You coming?" she asked. Marcus smiled. "Always," he said, and he meant it. They stepped inside together, closing the door on the night. Outside, the world continued on, indifferent and vast. But inside the Montgomery estate, two people had found something rare and precious. A second chance at trust, at connection, at love. And this time, neither of them was going to let fear stand in the way of holding on to it. The next morning, Marcus woke early to find Emma already in the kitchen, making coffee. She wore one of his old sweaters, the sleeves rolled up, her hair still messy from sleep. She looked more at home than any decorator had ever managed to make the expensive rooms feel. "Morning," she said, handing him a cup. "Morning," he replied, accepting it gratefully. He noticed she had made it exactly the way he liked it, even though he had never told her. She had simply paid attention, as she did with everything. They sat together at the small breakfast table, watching the sun rise over the gardens. The light streamed through the windows, golden and new, painting everything it touched with warmth. "I was thinking," Emma said after a while. "About what?" "About how this all started. With you testing me, watching me, waiting for me to fail." She looked at him with a slight smile. "It's funny how things work out." Marcus felt a pang of guilt. "I'm still sorry about that," he said. I should have trusted you from the beginning. Emma shook her head. No, I understand why you did it. You were hurt. You were protecting yourself. She reached across the table and took his hand. But I'm glad you eventually saw that not everyone is out to betray you. Some people really are just trying to do good. You more than did good, Marcus said firmly. You changed everything. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, then spent the morning working together in the garden. Emma showed Marcus the proper way to prune the roses, patiently correcting his technique until he got it right. He found he didn't mind being taught, didn't mind admitting he didn't know something. With Emma, there was no judgment, only gentle guidance. Around noon, Victoria stopped by with some documents for Marcus to review. She found them both covered in dirt, laughing over some private joke. She had never seen her boss like this, so relaxed, so genuinely happy. When Emma went inside to wash up, Victoria pulled Marcus aside. She's good for you, Victoria said simply. Don't let her get away again. Marcus watched Emma through the window, saw her humming as she washed soil from her hands. I don't intend to, he replied. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Emma would leave for classes 3 days a week, staying in the city at the small apartment the scholarship provided. But she spent every free moment at the estate, and Marcus found himself counting the hours until she returned. When she was there, the house felt alive. When she was gone, it felt like it was holding its breath. They didn't rush into anything. Both of them had been hurt before, had learned to be cautious, but slowly, steadily, they built something solid. They talked late into the night about their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Marcus told her about his parents, about growing up with wealth but without warmth. Emma shared stories about her childhood, about the mother who had taught her to sew those small embroidered flowers, about the series of jobs where she had never quite belonged. One evening, as they sat in the library with a fire crackling in the hearth, Emma asked the question she had been wondering about for months. What made you change your mind about me, she said. After you tested me that first time, what made you decide to trust me? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. It wasn't any one thing, he finally said. It was everything. The way you covered the money instead of taking it. The way you tucked a blanket over me when you thought I was sleeping. The way you cared for Harold and helped Roberto and taught Daniel. You showed me over and over that kindness wasn't a strategy for you. It was just who you are. He turned to look at her, and I realized that I had spent so long protecting myself from people who might hurt me that I had forgotten how to recognize people who wouldn't. I was so afraid of being betrayed again that I almost pushed away the best thing that ever happened to me. Emma's eyes glistened with tears. I never expected any of this, she whispered. I just wanted a job, a place to work where I could make a difference. And instead, you got me, Marcus said with a slight smile. I'm not sure that's a fair trade. Emma laughed, wiping her eyes. I think it's more than fair, she said. You gave me back something I thought I had lost. What's that? The belief that good things can happen, that not everyone will assume the worst, that sometimes, if you're patient and honest, people will see you for who you really are. They moved closer on the couch, Emma resting her head on Marcus's shoulder. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but inside everything was warm and safe. I love you, Marcus said quietly. The words felt strange and wonderful, terrifying and absolutely right. Emma lifted her head to look at him. I love you too, she replied. And this time, I'm not going anywhere. Marcus kissed her then, pouring all the emotion he couldn't express in words into that single gesture. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. The months that followed were the happiest Marcus could remember. Emma graduated at the top of her nursing class, and Marcus was there in the audience, bursting with pride as she walked across the stage. She accepted a position at a prestigious hospital in the city, splitting her time between her work and the estate, that had become her true home. Marcus found that his business didn't consume him the way it once had. He still worked hard, still built buildings and closed deals, but it wasn't his entire life anymore. He had something, someone, worth coming home to. And that changed everything. They made the estate theirs together, not just his. Emma's touches appeared throughout the house, fresh flowers in every room, comfortable furniture that invited people to actually sit, photographs on the walls of moments they had shared. The house that had once been a showpiece became a home. And on quiet evenings, when the day's work was done, and they sat together in the kitchen or walked through the gardens, Marcus would sometimes take out the handkerchief Emma had given him, the one with their names embroidered together. And he would think about how close he had come to losing this, to pushing away the one person who had seen past all his defenses to the man underneath. Emma would catch him looking at it and smile, knowing exactly what he was thinking. "We found each other," she would say. "That's what matters." And Marcus would nod, pulling her close, grateful beyond measure for a shy woman who had entered his life and changed everything. Not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through simple, steady kindness, through being exactly who she was, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. That, Marcus had learned, was the truest test of character. And Emma had passed it not because she was trying to prove anything, but because goodness was woven into the very fabric of who she was. In the end, it wasn't wealth or status or power that had saved Marcus Montgomery. It was love. The patient, enduring, transformative love of a woman who had asked for nothing but had given him everything that truly mattered. And as they stood together in the garden, where it had all begun, watching the sun set over the estate that was now truly their home, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he was the richest man in the world, not because of his bank account or his properties or his business empire, but because he had found something no amount of money could buy, someone who saw him completely and loved him anyway. That was worth more than all the wealth in the world. That was everything.